For thousands of years, the lost city of Atlantis has remained one of the greatest mysteries in human history. First described by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, Atlantis was said to be an advanced civilization that existed long before the rise of the known empires, a powerful society with incredible knowledge, technology, and influence. But some ancient traditions suggest that humanity may not have built the first great civilizations alone. In biblical texts, another mysterious race is mentioned, the Nephilim, giants said to have walked the earth in ancient times, possessing immense strength and forbidden knowledge. This raises a fascinating and controversial question. What if the legendary city of Atlantis was connected to the Nephilim? Could these mysterious giants have played a role in building one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world? And if so, what happened to them when Atlantis suddenly disappeared beneath the sea? To answer that question, we have to start at the very beginning, not with Plato, not with the Bible, but with the world as it actually was 12,000 years ago, a world so different from our own that we have barely begun to understand it. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had covered entire continents for tens of thousands of years were collapsing. Sea levels were rising at rates that would be catastrophic by any modern standard. Coastlines that had been inhabited for generations were disappearing beneath the ocean within human lifetimes. The geography of the Earth was being fundamentally rewritten, and somewhere in that disappearing world, in territories that are now beneath the sea, in civilizations whose physical remains were swallowed by rising water, something extraordinary existed, something that the survivors would spend the next 10,000 years trying to remember. Plato wrote about Atlantis in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, around 360 BC. He was careful, deliberate, and specific. He traced his source to the Athenian statesman Solon, who had received the account from Egyptian priests during his visit to Egypt around 590 BC. And the Egyptian priests were emphatic about one thing above all else. This was not a story. This was history, preserved in the temple archives of Egypt for thousands of years, passed down through the priestly tradition with the explicit insistence that every detail was accurate. The priests told Solon that the Greeks were like children compared to the Egyptians. Their civilization was young, their memory short, and they had forgotten things that the Egyptians had kept. One of those things was Atlantis. According to the priests, 9,000 years before their conversation with Solon, placing the events at approximately 9600 BC, there had existed a great civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, an island continent of extraordinary size, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization was powerful beyond anything in the known world. Its capital city was a marvel of engineering. Concentric rings of land and water, perfectly constructed, connected by canals, topped with temples of extraordinary beauty. At the center, a great temple sheathed in orichalcum, a metal that gleamed like living fire, that the ancient Greeks knew by name but could not identify with certainty. The Atlanteans controlled vast territories. They had established dominion across portions of Europe and North Africa. Their military was unmatched. Their technology was generations ahead of anything that existed elsewhere. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, it was gone, swallowed by the ocean. Destroyed so completely that even its location became a mystery. That is Plato's account, clean, specific, and supported by the authority of Egyptian temple records that no longer exist. But Plato tells us something else about Atlantis, something that most popular accounts of the story quietly omit. The Atlanteans were not entirely human. Plato is explicit. The civilization of Atlantis was founded by the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. Their offspring, 10 sons, the first kings of Atlantis, were divine human hybrids, beings who possessed the power of their divine father and the form of their human mother. Over generations, Plato tells us, the divine element in their bloodline diluted. The human nature grew stronger, and as it did, the Atlanteans changed. They became greedy, they became aggressive, they became imperial. They reached beyond their island, extending their dominion across the ancient world, until finally they made the decision that would destroy them, the decision to conquer everything. Read that again carefully. a civilization founded on the union of a divine being and a human woman, producing a race of hybrid kings with supernatural power, who built an extraordinary civilization, whose divine bloodline gradually corrupted into violence and domination, who were ultimately destroyed in a catastrophic flood. Now open the book of Genesis. In the 6th chapter, in language so compressed it seems almost deliberately obscure, the text describes divine beings, the sons of God, descending to earth and taking human women as wives. Their offspring are called the Nephilim, giants, heroes of old, men of renown, beings born of a union between the divine and the human, possessing the power of both, who built extraordinary things, whose presence transformed the ancient world, who descended into violence and tyranny, who were ultimately destroyed in a catastrophic flood. 2 accounts, 2 completely separate cultural traditions, 2 texts written centuries apart, drawing on sources that had no known contact with each other. One story, the same story. This is not coincidence. The structural parallels between the Atlantean tradition and the Nephilim tradition are too specific, too detailed, too precisely aligned to have emerged independently. We are looking at 2 different cultural memories of the same reality. But what was that reality? To understand it, we need to go deeper than Plato. We need to go to the oldest surviving text that deals with the Nephilim directly. A text so explosive in its implications that it was removed from the official biblical canon and suppressed for nearly 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire corpus of ancient literature. It predates the canonical Bible in its oldest portions. It is quoted directly by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament. It was considered authoritative by the earliest Christian and Jewish communities. And then, for reasons that remain deeply suspicious to anyone who examines them carefully, it was excluded from the canon and systematically suppressed. For over a millennium, it survived only in fragments, until a complete copy was discovered in Ethiopia in the 18th century, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had never stopped considering it scripture. What does the Book of Enoch contain that made it so dangerous? The answer begins with the Watchers, 200 of them, divine beings, led by a figure named Semyaza. They descended to earth on Mount Hermon, in the region that is now the border of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. They took human women as wives. They produced children, and those children were the Nephilim. But the Book of Enoch goes far beyond Genesis in what it records about what happened next. It describes the knowledge that the Watchers transferred to their offspring, and through them to early human civilization. A catalogue of forbidden sciences that reads less like ancient mythology and more like a technology transfer. Azazel taught the crafting of weapons, swords, knives, shields, armor, the art of war at a scale humanity had never known. He taught the working of metals in ways that the ancient world should not have possessed. Semyaza taught enchantments and the manipulation of natural forces. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments, the countering of supernatural power. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Tamiel taught the movement of the stars. Asradel taught the path of the moon. Astronomy, meteorology, military technology, metallurgy, the secret workings of the natural world. All of it poured into a pre-flood civilization through the Nephilim and their Watcher fathers. Now compare this to what Plato tells us about the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans possessed technology that was generations ahead of their contemporaries. They had mastered engineering at a scale that built the concentric ring city with its canals and bridges. They had metallurgical knowledge advanced enough to produce and work with orichalcum, a metal that modern science has still not definitively identified. They had naval technology and navigational knowledge that allowed them to control territories across the ancient world. Advanced metallurgy, advanced engineering, advanced astronomy and navigation, advanced military technology. The Watchers gave the Nephilim exactly the technological toolkit that would have produced exactly the civilization that Plato describes. What if the Nephilim and the Atlanteans are not 2 separate phenomena? What if they are 2 descriptions of the same phenomenon, a global civilization of divine human hybrids, seen from different geographic and cultural angles? The Nephilim tradition comes from the ancient Near East, the Tigris-Euphrates region, Canaan, the Eastern Mediterranean. It records the experience of peoples who lived under the direct physical domination of these beings. The Atlantean tradition comes through Egypt, preserved by priests who themselves descended from a civilization that was ancient even by their own standards. It records the civilization itself, from the inside, its architecture, its governance, its divine origins, its ultimate corruption. Two perspectives on the same reality, and the geography begins to make sense. Plato tells us that Atlantis sat in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and that the Atlanteans had extended their reach into the Western Mediterranean, Spain, and North Africa. Their military campaign at the end, the campaign that provoked divine destruction, was directed specifically at the Eastern Mediterranean, at Athens, at Egypt. The Nephilim, according to the traditions that describe them, dominated the ancient Near East. The lands around the Mediterranean's eastern shores, the territories of Canaan, Mesopotamia, Egypt. These are not two civilizations operating in separate worlds. These are two civilizations whose territories overlapped, whose spheres of influence were in direct competition, whose respective advantages, the Nephilim's raw physical power and military technology, the Atlanteans' advanced civilization and naval superiority, would have made any conflict between them an apocalyptic proposition. The Egyptian priests who told Solon about Atlantis mentioned specifically that it was Athens and Egypt that heroically resisted the Atlantean invasion. But why Egypt? What was Egypt's reason to resist so fiercely? Unless the pre-dynastic civilization that would become Egypt already had a history with the Atlanteans, an existing conflict, a territorial dispute, a war that predated the final invasion. The Nephilim controlled North African territories. The Nephilim were the dominant power in the lands that would become Egypt. And the Atlanteans were moving to conquer exactly those lands. The resistance that Plato describes, that seemingly impossible stand against the overwhelming power of Atlantis, may not have been purely human at all. Consider what the Atlantean civilization actually looked like from the outside. Plato describes a military power of extraordinary sophistication, massive fleets, disciplined armies, advanced weapons, a civilization that had been projecting military force across the ancient world for generations. Against this force, the humans of the ancient Near East, however civilized they had become under Nephilim guidance, would have had little chance. But the Nephilim themselves were a different matter entirely. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as beings of terrifying physical capability. The texts are specific about scale. Whatever precise measurement system was being used, the consistency across multiple ancient sources is unmistakable. These were beings whose physical superiority made them effectively unstoppable by any human military force. An Atlantean army, however advanced its weapons and tactics, would have been confronting an opponent unlike anything it had faced in its Western campaigns. Not human soldiers who could be demoralized and broken. Giants, beings whose Watcher-inherited knowledge of weapons and war matched or exceeded Atlantean military technology, and whose physical power had no equivalent. The war between Atlantis and the Eastern Mediterranean world, seen through this lens, takes on a completely different character. It was not an advanced civilization conquering primitive peoples. It was a collision between two branches of the same fundamental phenomenon, divine human hybridization producing civilizations of supernatural capability, meeting on opposite sides of the ancient Mediterranean world. And the collision, by every ancient account, was catastrophic. The Book of Enoch describes the world of the Nephilim in its final phase as a place of uncontrolled violence. The Nephilim themselves had turned on each other. They had consumed the resources of the ancient world without restraint. Human civilization groaned under their domination. The earth itself, the text tells us, cried out to the heavens for relief. Plato's account of Atlantis in its final phase is strikingly similar. The Atlanteans, once noble and restrained, had become consumed by greed and aggression. The divine element in their bloodline had been diluted to near nothing. They had launched a massive military campaign, and the gods, specifically Zeus, looked down at the corruption of the Atlantean bloodline and gathered in divine council to determine what must be done. Two ancient texts, two different cultural traditions, both describing the same scenario, a pre-flood world in crisis, dominated by hybrid divine-human civilizations that had become dangerously out of control, prompting direct divine intervention. In Enoch, 4 archangels are dispatched: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, with specific military assignments: bind the Watchers, destroy the Nephilim, cleanse the earth. In Plato, Zeus convenes the divine council. The decision is made: Atlantis is destroyed. In both accounts, the mechanism of destruction involves catastrophic flooding. In both accounts, the civilization of the pre-flood world is effectively reset. In both accounts, something survives, because the flood in every ancient account does not destroy everything. It destroys the dominant civilization. It scatters the survivors. It resets the balance. But knowledge, once acquired, does not simply disappear. The survivors of Atlantis, if the Egyptian tradition is accurate, carried their knowledge with them. Scattered across the world by the catastrophe, they arrived in human communities as beings of extraordinary capability, as teachers, as builders, as the divine ancestors that every post-flood civilization claims to have received its gifts from. The survivors of the Nephilim, the Gibborim, the mighty ones that Genesis confirms were present even after the flood, did the same, integrated into the rebuilding human world, sharing what remained of their inherited knowledge, becoming the god-kings and divine ancestors of the new civilizations. And in the territories that would become Egypt, the traditions of both may have merged. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, is one of the most extraordinary ideas in the entire ancient world. It describes a primordial era when the gods themselves walked the earth, when divine beings and humans coexisted directly, when knowledge flowed freely between the cosmic and the human realm, an era before history, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids even, or rather, the era that the pyramids were built to remember and honor. What if Zep Tepi is the memory of the pre-flood world? The time when both the Nephilim and the Atlanteans still existed? When the height of what had ever been achieved on Earth was still present and alive? The structures that post-flood Egypt built, structures whose astronomical precision, whose engineering sophistication, whose sheer physical ambition dwarfs almost everything that came after them, may be the reconstruction of something that already existed. A rebuilding from memory, an attempt to recreate with reduced resources and reduced knowledge, something of what the pre-flood world had achieved. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes mathematical and astronomical knowledge that we are still discovering. Its orientation to true north is more accurate than any modern building. Its internal chambers encode the precession of the equinoxes. Its external dimensions encode pi and phi to a degree that could not be achieved by accident. This is not the work of a civilization that was inventing these things for the first time. This is the work of a civilization that was remembering them. And what was being remembered? The knowledge of the Watchers, passed to the Nephilim, inherited by the Atlanteans in a different form, merged in the post-flood world, encoded in stone so that it could never be fully lost again. The Hall of Records, the repository of pre-flood knowledge that ancient Egyptian tradition insists was buried by the survivors of the Great Catastrophe, may still exist, somewhere beneath the Giza Plateau, in chambers that ground-penetrating radar has suggested but that official archaeology has never opened. The accumulated knowledge of the pre-flood world may be waiting, not as myth, not as legend, as actual physical records, preserved specifically for a world that would one day be ready to receive them. But why does any of this matter now? Why does a story about giants and a lost civilization 12,000 years ago have any relevance to the world we live in today? Because the knowledge never stopped traveling. The Babylonian astronomical records that allowed ancient priests to predict eclipses with extraordinary precision, records that required centuries of observation to compile, centuries that Babylon did not officially have, came from somewhere. They were inherited from a tradition older than Babylon, a tradition whose origins the Babylonians themselves traced back to the Apkallu, the 7 sages who survived the flood and brought civilization to the new world. 7 sages, pre-flood survivors, carriers of extraordinary knowledge. That knowledge passed from Babylon to Greece. From Greece it became the foundation of Western philosophy and science, Pythagoras traveled to Babylon and Egypt specifically to receive this ancient knowledge. Plato's own cosmology, the mathematical structure of reality, the divine proportions, the music of the spheres, traces directly to the Babylonian-Egyptian synthesis of pre-flood wisdom. From Greece to Alexandria, the great library collected and preserved it all. From Alexandria to the Islamic scholars of the medieval period, who saved it when the Western world forgot. From the Islamic world back to Renaissance Europe, where it sparked the scientific revolution. Every step of that transmission is historically documented. The chain is unbroken. What is not documented, what is denied, suppressed, or simply not asked about, is where the chain begins. It begins in Babylon, and Babylon traces its wisdom to before the flood, to the sages who survived, to the civilization that was destroyed, to Atlantis, and behind Atlantis, behind the Nephilim, behind all of it, the original source, the Watchers who descended on Mount Hermon, the divine beings who transferred to early humanity a catalogue of knowledge that our entire civilization has been slowly, imperfectly, incompletely rediscovering ever since. We are not the first advanced civilization on this planet. We are the inheritors of one, perhaps of two, perhaps of a lineage of knowledge so old that our deepest myths are just the most recent version of a story that has been told since the very beginning of human memory. The Nephilim are gone. Atlantis is beneath the ocean. The world they built was destroyed by a catastrophe so complete that almost nothing physical survived, but the knowledge survived. It is in the mathematical proportions of the pyramids, in the astronomical alignments of Göbekli Tepe, in the legal codes that trace their roots to Hammurabi and through Hammurabi to something far older, in the navigational knowledge that made the ancient world more connected than we ever imagined, in the cosmological understanding that every major civilization has carried in some form from the moment civilization began, hiding in plain sight, in the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from, in the monuments we cannot fully explain, in the myths we have dismissed as primitive imagination and which may turn out to be the most accurate history we have. The lost city of Atlantis was not just a city. It was a civilization built on the union of the divine and the human, possessing knowledge and power that the entire span of recorded history has not surpassed. Destroyed by a catastrophe that reset the world, and its legacy, encoded in the stones and the stars and the stories that survived, is still here, still shaping the world, still waiting to be fully understood. Perhaps that understanding is closer than we think. Perhaps the sealed chambers beneath the ancient sands are not empty. Perhaps the answer to where we came from and what we are capable of becoming is already written. We just have to be ready to read it.